All right, so today I'm going to talk about the endocannabinoid system, which is shortly called the ECS, and talk a little bit about how CBD can be used in your practice. And once you understand the kind of the simple fundamental aspects of CBD and how the physiological responses are in terms of receptors, immune system, and inflammation, then you'll be able to understand how to recommend it to your patients. There's a lot of misinformation on the internet, a lot of testimonials, a lot of just fancy marketing. Today we want to get to the science. So once you understand the science, then you can kind of understand how to navigate from marketing and also navigate for sometimes the misinformation that the patients also might be asking for or looking for. So I just want to let you know that I am a medical advisor for Vita Plus, and I am an author of An Inflammation Nation. So let's get started. So the purpose of the lecture is I want to describe, basically, the differences in short of when we say CBD and its derivatives, either coming from cannabis or marijuana, as we call loosely, which in certain states like California, I believe is legal for both medical and recreational use. But in other states, it's only used, like in my state of New Mexico, where I'm from, here in Albuquerque, it's only for medical use, and people have to get a card, and we have to go see a doctor and fill out a form, etc. And we'll talk about the differences between that and what we're going to be kind of focusing a little bit, although it applies to both, is where CBD is being derived from what we call hemp oil. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I also want to bring a little bit of the importance of the Farm Bill, which was passed last year, so everybody can understand the kind of the legislation that has been passed and how do we need to interpret that legislation. So again, there's a lot of misunderstanding of certain type of legislative bills that are passed, and people just kind of jump forward and think everything is perfect and fine. Unfortunately, due to time, we're not going to be able to show you, but there's a cool video that we've been working on. I've been consulting for with the University of Toronto, and it actually will show the endocannabinoid system like in a visual form. And maybe what we'll do is we'll schedule another time where we can actually show you. I'll be describing it, show you some photos and pictures, but when you actually see these things in action, sometimes when we talk about these receptors, it's hard to understand because, like say in acupuncture school or the OM school or even medical school, we learn about the physiology, but sometimes, seeing these things in the immune system, that wasn't really shown in textbooks. And so eventually when you see these things, and I think the sponsor may even have some of these videos online that you can take a look at just to enhance your further understanding of how the system works. More importantly, though, I'm going to talk today about the CB1 and CB2 receptors and then how they actually play a role and when are they regulating acute and chronic inflammatory responses and how it stimulates immune system functioning. And then once you understand this, then you'll understand the uniqueness and also the complexity of how this wonderful product that I use in my practice every day. And then also we'll talk about how you can use it in your just primary care patients as well. So in short, I want to just show you, hopefully you can see my little cursor here, but, when we say cannabis, so cannabis is just the family name of the plant, okay? And, cannabis has this loose term, and, there's two types of plants that are in the same family of cannabis. One is marijuana, which people think of as just weed, right? Marijuana, the loose kind of slang term. And then industrial hemp, which has now received more notoriety and use in public all over the place. So the difference is that, first of all, just the words, CBD cannabinoids. CBD is actually, there's over 100, and they might even think, because they're always discovering more of these compounds, maybe 140, maybe 160, maybe up to 200 different compounds called cannabinoids. So CBD is just the kind of the topic of the summary of this category of ingredients. And the second category of ingredients that is found in the plant is called THC. THC is the psychoactive part that gets people high. THC is what is regulated, which makes cannabis illegal in certain places. That is just legal, that you cannot take it. So different states will allow that. And then when you get it from hemp, for example, hemp is something where that sister plant, has about 0.3% or less. And I'll explain what that is. So 0.3% or less, that's a trace amount, and we'll talk about how that can be used. And now what I use in my practice is something called broad spectrum. Broad spectrum CBD means basically they remove this 0.3% to make it 0%. And I'll explain why that might be important for certain patients and certain clientele, and also compliance. And one just an interesting note real quick is that with marijuana, it now, this is an old slide, but the data now will show that it has about anywhere from 15 to 30% THC. In 1960, cannabis, so people who smoked weed in the 60s for recreational use, it had about 6% THC. So the stuff that is actually used in dispensaries now or grown is actually genetically enhanced. So this number is, multiple times higher in concentration. So this is more like a pharmaceutical. That's why when people who now, once these states have legalized and say, oh yeah, I smoked back then and now I try this again, and they couldn't get off their couch, is because it's a lot stronger in terms of that psychoactive component. Now, let's get to the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is interesting because it was, basically just the end of December, right before we went on holiday, it was signed and approved by Congress. And what it is that it says that hemp-derived CBD is no longer a controlled substance. Before then, actually CBD was on a Schedule 1. They actually used to say that was more dangerous than heroin, for example. So they took it off the controlled substance list, and it's no longer controlled by the Drug Enforcement Agency. Now, just because it's no longer controlled by the DEA, it is still regulated and overseen by FDA, Food and Drug Administration. But as long as the CBD has less than 0.3%, which would be a full spectrum, or if you move to a broad spectrum, which means 0%, then you're completely in the clear of having any other issues. Now, although this is a federal bill, okay, and say for example, California, most of the people here in California, it's legal, but in other states, it's actually the states can supersede their own federal rules. So some places it's a little bit more tricky, in which some places cannot use even CBD, even though federally it's approved. The states can have their own regulations. So depending on the state, you might have to look at it if you're outside of California. However, you can't technically get in trouble if you're just using, a CBD that's from hemp oil, and it's usually 0.3%, or in my case, I like to use the broad spectrum. Now, it is legal and it must be labeled correctly. So this is the big misnomer understanding right now, because on the internet, you'll still see this word CBD, CBD, CBD. And it used to be because we used to have something called hemp oil. And remember, we also have cooking hemp oil, right? Like from hemp seeds, for example, that do not have the CBD part. And so when CBD actually was available in use over the last, say, 7-8 years, a lot of people rushed to put the word CBD to distinguish, well, this has the medicinal part of it, these cannabinoids, and it wasn't just the oil. And now, unfortunately, we have to go back to changing this, because we'll talk about a little bit later in this lecture, is that there is also, last November, the FDA did approve a isolate of CBD called Epidiolex, which is by prescriptions that people actually can use for seizure syndrome. And so since now we have a drug that is actually approved by FDA and dispensed by pharmacies, and MDs can write for it, then the word CBD cannot be used on the label. And the reason being is because this now is owned, or this would be considered a patent infringement or infringement on a drug ingredient. So you want to make sure that with products that you're using, you want to make sure that they're in compliance, because you also don't want to get in trouble by a company saying, oh yeah, this is okay. And so when you look at the brands that that you should be looking at, or the ones that I would use, they always just say the word hemp oil rather than CBD. And so you'll see this transition in the next year, like everybody bought domains, everybody had all these things, and now they have to slowly switch over. And again, full spectrum meaning 0.3% less, and then and broad spectrum 100% free THC. And I'll explain the benefits of why in a second. So the endocannabinoid system in more detail, just, if I would recommend later on, we'll probably be able to have a link or something for the video, but just to show you, there's two types of receptors, and one called CB1 and one that's called CB2. There's actually a third receptor that's actually GPR55. So there's actually be more than just these two receptors, because the science is evolving as we go on. But the key that I want to get across that everybody should need to know is that it's not a simple on and off receptor. It is not like a pharmaceutical drug, which we give as a kind of a targeted therapy, a one-to-one relationship where we just give one drug to block one receptor. We're talking about a complex cascade of effects turning on and off a variety of aspects. And so through a variety of proteins and regulators and channels, these things are stimulating targets. And these targets, as you can see here, just in this, and this is like for neurological disorders, how it affects just in the brain, okay, is enzymes, receptors, ion channels, and transporters. So again, even though we think of there's just one receptor, think of it like if you're turning on an on switch, but the on switch turns on a piano, and the piano is just playing, all these keys and notes. So it's not like I give a drug, or someone takes a drug and it's like, okay, I'm blocking this enzyme pathway with XYZ, or I'm suppressing this receptor or downregulating it. Here, it's actually turning on the body's innate system, which I'll explain in a second. So just, I really want to hit home the complexity, so it's not just like most people think, on and off. Now, CB1, we used to just think of CB1 just in the brain and central nervous system. And in fact, predominantly most of CB1 is. Okay, so they used to say CB1 above the head and CB2 receptors below the head, but now we know that there's a mix of both. Okay, but CB1 receptors are in the brain, and you can see it's for memory, cognition, emotion, motor, and pain. Now, again, it's not just a simple receptor, but it's found throughout all these variety of regions of the brain. So cingulate, gyrus, the front and parietal regions, the hippocampus, or the thalamus, and brainstem, cerebellum. So almost every part. In fact, it's the most dense receptor of the brain. So interesting thing is, we did not learn as physicians, we did not learn about CBD, cannabidiol receptors, 1 and 2, endocannabinoid system in medical school. So if I went to the neurologist today in neurosurgery, and I opened the door when they're doing neurosurgery, say taking a glioblastoma tumor out, and I would ask them, what's the number one most dense receptor of their brain? They would not know it's CB1, because it wasn't taught in medical school, because we're pretty much taught, if there's a drug and there's a receptor, we're kind of taught this drug pharmaco model, surgery model. But now, as science is evolving, we're understanding, like, oh my God, this is something that is innate not only to us as humans, but all mammals have this endocannabinoid system. That's why you now see CBD using for pets, for example. Okay. And so one thing that's really interesting is here is that it acts when we talk about, especially with pain, and we talk about analgesia and kind of this lowering this inflammatory responses, is that it acts on what they call a presynaptic gamma aminobutyric acid presynaptic bouton. So just real quick, I don't know if you guys can see me, but usually with neurons, there's a neuron on top and a neuron. You always see these like little neurons, right? The signal will come down, it releases through this little cleft, it stimulates a receptor on the other side, and the signal continues down. Like you always see these little videos, right? And they always draw how neurons work. The interesting thing how CBD works and how the own endocannabinoid, meaning your own body's system, is doing that, is that it's actually from the postsynaptic cleft. It will send receptors up to the presynaptic cleft, and it turns it down through the ion channels through a variety of these signals here, and it prevents the downregulation. So it's actually termed, it's quite complex, but it's called depolarization induced suppression of inhibition. So it's not just turning it off, it's doing what the body normally does. When it has pain, you need to have a certain amount of pain, you need to have a certain amount of inflammation, but you don't want to have too much. And if there's too much, the body starts to try to regulate itself to say, hey, I need to shut down some of the signals because I need to still function. So the important thing to understand is not just it's turning it on, it's stimulating what the body was already intended to do, just that when there's inflammatory diseases, when there's trauma, when there's injury, the body doesn't have enough of those signals because of the dysfunctions. And therefore, this is where the endocannabinoid system and stimulating it through things like CBD is super important.